A Werewolf Shifter Romance. Written by Amelia Hart. Chapter 1. Flight through Snow Isla stood before the tarnished mirror in the tower chamber, her reflection distorted by age-worn glass. The ceremonial gown they had forced upon her hung heavy across her shoulders, white silk embroidered with silver thread that caught the afternoon light streaming through narrow windows. The fabric was meant to symbolize purity, devotion, willing sacrifice. All lies. Her fingers trembled as she traced the delicate beadwork along the neckline. 22 years of life. And this was what it had come to. Payment for her uncle's debts. Currency to settle accounts with a monster. Stop fidgeting. Her cousin Saris yanked at the laces of Isla's bodice, pulling them tight with practiced motions that bordered on cruel. You should be grateful. Lord Torben could have chosen any Omega in 3 territories. He chose you. Isla met Karis's gaze in the mirror. Her cousin's expression held no sympathy, only resentment that had festered since Isla's father died 3 years ago in the border wars. Since her uncle Garrick had assumed leadership of their small pack, and declared Isla's presence a burden rather than a blessing. Grateful, Isla repeated, the word tasting like ash, for being sold to a man who buried 3 wives before their 30th year. Karis's hand cracked across Isla's cheek, the sound sharp in the confined space. Watch your tongue. Lord Torben is a powerful alpha. His gold will save this pack from starvation. Or would you prefer we all die because you're too proud to do your duty? The sting of the slap faded quickly, but the words burrowed deeper. Duty. As if she owed anything to the pack that had turned her into merchandise the moment her father's body was returned from battle. As if her mother's death bringing Isla into the world hadn't already paid whatever debt blood could settle. Isla turned away from the mirror, away from the reflection of a woman dressed for slaughter. Through the tower window, she could see the great hall below where guests were already gathering. Alphas and their entourages from neighboring territories, drawn by the promise of alliance, and the spectacle of watching Garrick's orphaned niece become Torben's 4th bride. 4th. The number haunted her. Torben's first wife had died from a fall down stone stairs. The second from a mysterious illness that had consumed her over 3 agonizing months. The third had disappeared entirely, her body found weeks later in the river, weighted down with rocks. Accidents, all of them. Tragedies. Nothing that could be proven otherwise. But Isla had heard the whispers in the kitchens, seen the way servants crossed themselves when Torben's name was mentioned. She had watched her uncle accept the bride price with hands that shook slightly, his eyes refusing to meet hers as he counted out the gold coins that would allegedly save their pack from ruin. A knock at the door made both women turn. The pack's elder priest entered, his weathered face solemn beneath a crown of white hair. It is time, child. Lord Torben awaits at the altar. Isla's stomach twisted. She wanted to refuse, to scream that she wouldn't do this. But what choice existed? Her father was dead. Her mother had been dead since the moment Isla drew her first breath. She had no siblings, no advocates, no power within a pack that viewed her as expendable. The walk to the great hall felt like descending into a tomb. Stone corridors echoed with her footsteps, each one carrying her closer to an inevitable end. Saris walked behind her, adjusting the train of the gown, ensuring every detail appeared perfect for witnesses who would remember this day as a celebration rather than an execution. The great hall doors opened, and the assembled crowd turned as one. Isla forced herself to look straight ahead, past the rows of seated guests, toward the altar where Torben waited. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and thick through the chest, his 45 years showing in the gray threaded through his dark beard. He wore formal leathers studded with silver, a heavy fur cloak draped across his shoulders. Everything about him projected power, wealth, dominance. Everything about him made Isla's skin crawl with instinctive revulsion. She walked down the center aisle on unsteady legs, past faces she recognized and many she didn't. Her uncle stood near the front, his expression carefully neutral. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Coward. The priest began speaking, his voice droning through traditional words about unity and strength, and the bonds that tied packs together in alliance. Isla barely heard him, her attention fixed on Torben, on the way his eyes tracked her approach with an intensity that felt predatory rather than admiring. When she reached the altar, Torben extended his hand. The priest gestured for her to take it, to complete this portion of the ritual. Standard practice, meant to symbolize willing acceptance of the bond being formed. Isla hesitated. Something deep within her recoiled from the thought of touching him, a warning that went beyond rational fear into territory she didn't fully understand. "Take his hand, girl," her uncle hissed from his seat. The assembled witnesses watched in expectant silence. Refusing would humiliate Torben publicly, would give him cause to reject the marriage and demand his gold returned. Gold her uncle had already spent on debts and supplies. The pack would suffer. Isla would suffer. She placed her hand in Torben's. The world exploded. It wasn't physical contact so much as a violation. Something tearing open inside Isla's mind that she hadn't known existed. Images flooded her consciousness in a torrent too fast to process individually, each one carrying emotional weight that crushed breath from her lungs. A woman screaming as she fell, her terror absolute in the moment before stone stairs ended her. Another woman, thin and wasted, begging for death while poison worked through her system in measured doses. The third, struggling against hands that held her underwater, bubbles rising as her lungs filled. Pleasure. Torben felt pleasure in their deaths, satisfaction in their suffering, pride in his cleverness at arranging accidents that couldn't be proven, and anticipation, bright and eager, for the moment when Isla would join their number. She jerked her hand back as if burned, gasping. The connection severed, but the knowledge remained. The truth of what Torben was, what he intended, branded itself across her awareness with absolute certainty. The priest frowned. "Child, you must maintain contact for the blessing to—" "No!" Isla's voice came out stronger than she'd expected, loud in the sudden quiet of the hall. "I refuse this bond." Torben's expression shifted from surprise to anger in the span of a heartbeat. "What did you say?" "I said no." Isla backed away from the altar, away from the man whose hands had murdered 3 women and would murder her given the chance. "I will not marry you. I will not. This is unacceptable." Her uncle surged to his feet, face flushing red. "Isla, you will complete this ceremony immediately, or I will—" Isla didn't wait to hear the threat. She ran. The wedding gown wasn't designed for speed, but terror lent her strength she hadn't known she possessed. She sprinted toward the nearest exit, past shocked guests, past guards too surprised to react immediately. Behind her, chaos erupted. Torben's roar of fury, her uncle shouting orders, the crash of benches being overturned as people rose in confusion. Isla burst through a side door into the tower stairwell she'd descended earlier. But instead of climbing up, she went down, taking steps 2 at a time, the heavy gown threatening to tangle her legs with each stride. Her breathing came ragged, heart hammering against ribs. She had felt it. Felt his intentions as clearly as if he'd spoken them aloud. Not just desire to control her or use her for alliance, but genuine anticipation of ending her life, of watching her suffer, of adding her to his collection of dead wives. The knowledge terrified her, less than the certainty with which she knew it was true. How had she known? What had happened when their hands touched? No time to analyze. Footsteps thundered in the corridor above, guards pursuing, Torben shouting something about a frightened bride needing to be retrieved. Isla reached the ground floor and changed direction, heading toward the kitchens. Servants scattered as she ran past, the white ceremonial gown billowing behind her like a ghost's shroud. She grabbed a heavy cloak from a peg near the scullery door, throwing it over her shoulders to hide the distinctive dress. The stables. She needed a horse. Needed to get far from this place before they caught her and dragged her back to complete the ceremony her uncle would insist proceed. Cold air hit her face as she stumbled outside. Snow had begun falling, fat flakes that melted against her flushed skin. The stables stood across the courtyard, and Isla ran toward them with everything she had left. Inside, horses stamped and shifted in their stalls, sensing her distress. She grabbed the nearest saddle, her fingers fumbling with buckles and straps. A gray mare, young and strong, stood relatively calm as Isla worked. "Please," Isla whispered to the animal. Though whether she was asking the horse or some higher power for help, she wasn't certain. "Please let me get out of here." Shouts from the courtyard. They were coming. Isla abandoned proper saddling and simply threw herself onto the mare's back, clinging to the animal's mane. She kicked her heels, and the horse responded, lunging forward out of the stall and toward the stable's rear exit. The gate stood closed. Isla aimed the mare at it and prayed. The horse gathered herself and jumped, clearing the wooden barrier with inches to spare. They landed hard on the other side, and Isla nearly lost her seat, but managed to hold on through desperation alone. Then they were running, hooves pounding against snow-covered ground as the mare raced away from the pack house, away from Torben, away from everything Isla had ever known. Behind her, more shouts, the sound of other horses being readied for pursuit. But she had a lead, and she intended to use it. Isla urged the mare toward the mountains, toward the treacherous high country where few would follow in a snowstorm. The horse responded gamely, her breathing steady despite the pace. Snow fell heavier now, obscuring visibility, turning the world into a blur of white and gray. The ceremonial gown snagged on branches as they entered the forest at the mountain's base. Fabric tore, delicate embroidery shredding against rough bark. Isla didn't care. The dress was meant for a wedding that would have ended in murder. Let it be destroyed. They climbed higher, the mare's breathing growing labored as the incline steepened. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit faded, swallowed by wind and distance. But Isla didn't slow. Couldn't slow. Not until she put enough space between herself and the men who would drag her back to Torben's waiting hands. Hours passed. The storm intensified, transforming from gentle snowfall to howling blizzard. Visibility dropped to mere feet. The temperature plummeted. Isla's fingers grew numb where they gripped the mare's mane, her body shaking with cold despite the cloak. The horse stumbled, exhausted. Isla pulled her to a stop beneath a cluster of evergreens that provided minimal shelter from the wind. The mare's sides heaved, breath coming in great clouds of steam. "I'm sorry," Isla told her, sliding from the animal's back on legs that barely supported her weight. "You saved my life. Thank you." The mare nuzzled her shoulder briefly, then stood with head lowered, too tired to move further. Isla knew they couldn't stay here. The cold would kill them both if they remained stationary in this storm. But pushing on seemed equally impossible. The mare was done, and Isla herself felt the insidious creep of hypothermia setting into her limbs, making her thoughts slow and confused. She had to find shelter, had to keep moving. Isla left the mare beneath the trees and pushed forward on foot, each step a monumental effort. The white gown, soaked through with snow, clung to her legs like icy chains. She stumbled, caught herself, stumbled again. The world reduced itself to the next step, and the next, and the one after that. Isla lost track of direction, of time, of everything except the desperate need to keep moving, because stopping meant dying. Dawn broke gray and cheerless through the storm. Isla barely noticed. Her body had gone beyond cold into numbness. She couldn't feel her feet anymore, couldn't feel her hands. Moving was automatic, instinctive, divorced from conscious thought. Then, through the swirling snow, a shape emerged. Dark stone walls, a chimney, a building, a cabin. Isla staggered toward it, falling twice before reaching the door. Her numb fingers found the latch. Unlocked. Blessing or trap, she no longer cared. Warmth. The promise of shelter. She pushed the door open and collapsed across the threshold into darkness. Chapter 2. The Stranger's Truth. Warmth reached Isla first, pulling her from darkness that had threatened to become permanent. The crackle of fire, the scent of burning wood and something else, leather and pine and smoke that spoke of habitation rather than wilderness. Her body ached in ways that suggested she had survived something her mind hadn't yet caught up to understanding. She opened her eyes to unfamiliar surroundings. Rough-hewn wooden beams crossed overhead, supporting a ceiling darkened by years of hearth smoke. Furs covered her, heavy and warm, their weight pressing her into a mattress stuffed with what felt like straw and moss. The ceremonial gown still clung to her body beneath the furs, though the fabric had dried into stiff, uncomfortable wrinkles. Isla pushed herself upright, ignoring the protest of muscles that felt like they'd been beaten. The cabin was small, a single room divided by function rather than walls. A stone fireplace dominated one side, flames dancing cheerfully behind a crude iron grate. Weapons hung on the walls, hunting knives and a well-maintained bow with a quiver of arrows. Shelves held provisions, dried meat and grain sacks and pottery vessels sealed with wax. And near the fire, seated on a rough wooden stool, a man sharpened a hunting knife with slow, methodical strokes. He was large, broad through the shoulders in a way that spoke of strength, built through use rather than display. Dark hair fell past his collar, and a neatly trimmed beard framed a strong jaw. He wore simple clothing, a worn linen shirt and leather breeches, both well made but showing signs of long use. Scars marked his visible forearms, pale lines against skin that suggested he spent time outdoors. When he looked up, meeting her gaze across the cabin's dim interior, Isla felt something catch in her chest. His eyes were gray-silver, the color of storm clouds, and they held an intensity that made her instinctively pull the furs higher around her shoulders. "You're awake," he said, his voice deeper than she'd expected. Rough from disuse or perhaps simply from nature. "Good. I was starting to worry you wouldn't wake at all." Isla's throat felt raw when she tried to speak. "Where?" The word came out as a croak. He set the knife aside and stood, moving with a controlled grace that reminded Isla of the way predators moved, efficient and purposeful. He crossed to the shelves and returned with a clay cup filled with water. "Drink slowly," he instructed, offering the cup but maintaining distance, not approaching the bed where she sat. Isla took the cup with hands that trembled. The water was cold and clean, soothing her abused throat. She drank half of it before forcing herself to stop and breathe. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice stronger now. "My cabin. About 15 miles into the high country north of the valleys." He returned to his stool by the fire, giving her space. "You collapsed on my doorstep around dawn. That was yesterday." Yesterday. Isla tried to process that. She'd lost an entire day to unconsciousness. The storm ended this morning. 3 feet of new snow. He picked up his knife again, resumed the steady rhythm of sharpening, though his attention never fully left her. "You're fortunate you found shelter. Another hour in that cold would have killed you." The casual way he said it made Isla's stomach twist. She looked down at herself, at the ruined wedding gown visible beneath the furs. The delicate embroidery was torn, mud-stained, destroyed beyond any hope of repair, evidence of her flight. When she looked up again, the man was watching her with those storm-gray eyes, and his next words made ice reform in her veins despite the fire's warmth. "I know who you are." Isla's breath stopped. Her first instinct was to run, to throw off the furs and bolt for the door. But her body betrayed her, still too weak from exposure and exhaustion to manage more than a pathetic attempt to swing her legs over the bed's edge. The man didn't move from his stool, but his voice carried quiet authority. "Don't. You'll only hurt yourself and there's nowhere to run. The snow is too deep and you're still recovering. Then why?" Isla forced the words past her fear. "Why tell me you know? Why not just turn you over to Lord Torben's men?" He set the knife down completely now, giving her his full attention. "They came through yesterday afternoon, about 6 hours after I brought you inside. Offered gold for information about a runaway bride in a white dress." Isla's hands clenched in the furs. "What did you tell them?" "That I'd seen no one. That the storm was too fierce for anyone to have made it this far into the mountains." His expression remained neutral, unreadable. "They didn't believe me at first. Wanted to search the cabin. I convinced them otherwise." The way he said it suggested the convincing hadn't been entirely verbal. Isla studied him more carefully now, taking in details she'd missed in her initial panic. The scars on his forearms continued up past where his sleeves ended. His hands, though steady on the whetstone, bore the calluses of someone accustomed to weapons and hard work, and there was something in the way he held himself, a confidence that came from knowing he could handle threats when they arose. "Why?" The question emerged smaller than Isla intended. "Why lie for me? You don't know me. You don't know why I ran. I know the reputation of the man you were running from." Something dark flickered across his features, gone too quickly for Isla to identify. "That's reason enough." He stood again, moving to the shelves. This time he returned with a wooden bowl containing what looked like stew, steam rising from its surface. You need to eat. You were half frozen and completely exhausted. Food will help. Isla accepted the bowl cautiously, her stomach clenching at the rich smell of meat and vegetables. When had she last eaten? Before the ceremony, certainly. More than a day ago now. She ate slowly, each spoonful settling warmth into her core. The man, her unexpected rescuer, returned to his work by the fire, giving her space to process everything that had happened. Between bites, Isla studied him, tried to reconcile the man who'd saved her life with the casual admission that he knew exactly who she was and what she was fleeing. Most people in the kingdom would have known about the wedding. Garrick had made certain everyone understood his pack's alliance with Torben, had proclaimed it as a triumph of diplomacy. "What's your name?" she asked finally. He glanced up from the blade he'd returned to sharpening. "Dorian. Just Dorian. No pack affiliation, no family name. The mark of someone trying to disappear, or someone who'd been cast out. Are you exiled?" The question emerged before Isla could think better of it. Dorian's hand stilled for the briefest moment before resuming their work. "What makes you ask that? You live alone in the high country. You give only a first name. You help a fugitive without hesitation." Isla set the empty bowl aside. Those aren't the actions of someone with ties to any pack. A ghost of something that might have been amusement crossed his features. "You're observant. I'm alive because I pay attention." "Fair enough." He set the whetstone down, resting his forearms on his knees as he leaned forward. "Yes, I've been exiled for 8 years, sent into these mountains with orders never to return to the territories below on pain of death. 8 years. Isla tried to calculate how old that made him. Late 20s, perhaps? Young to have earned such severe punishment. "What did you do?" she asked, then immediately regretted the rudeness of the question. "I'm sorry. That's not... I refused an order from an alpha." Dorian interrupted, his voice flat. "One I considered unjust. I was punished accordingly." The stark way he said it suggested layers of complexity he wasn't sharing, but Isla understood the desire to keep certain pains private. She had her own secrets, her own wounds that didn't bear examination in the presence of strangers. "Thank you," she said instead, "for helping me, for lying to the guards, for not demanding to know why I fled my own wedding." Dorian's gray eyes met hers again, and this time Isla saw something in them that made her breath catch. Not desire or threat, but recognition, as if he saw past the ruined dress and desperate circumstances to something deeper. "You don't owe me explanations," he said quietly. "Whatever your reasons were, they were yours. I'm certain they were valid." The simple acceptance of that statement did something unexpected to Isla's composure. Tears burned at the back of her throat, threatening to spill. No one had simply accepted her choice without demanding justification. Not her uncle, not Saris, not any of the pack members who'd witnessed her flight. She blinked hard, forcing the tears back. "How long can I stay?" "Until it's safe for you to leave." Dorian stood, moving to add wood to the fire. "The guards will likely search again once the snow settles. In a few days, perhaps a week. They'll assume you died in the storm. Then you can decide where you want to go." A week. The timeline felt both impossibly long and dangerously short. Where would she go after that? She had no allies, no pack willing to shelter someone who'd humiliated a powerful alpha. Her uncle certainly wouldn't take her back, not after the gold he'd have to return to Torben. "What happens if they come back before then?" Isla asked. "They won't find you." The certainty in his voice brooked no argument. "I give you my word." Words. Promises. Isla had learned to trust neither, but there was something about the way Dorian said it, the weight he put behind the simple statement, that made her want to believe him. She shifted on the bed, suddenly aware of how exposed she was in the destroyed wedding gown. "Do you have anything I could wear? This dress is... ruined." "Yes." Dorian moved to a wooden chest near the far wall and pulled out a simple tunic and breeches. "These will be too large, but they're better than what you have." He tossed them to her, then turned his back with deliberate courtesy, facing the fire while she changed. The gesture surprised Isla. Most men wouldn't have bothered with such consideration. She peeled off the ceremonial gown with relief, letting the destroyed silk fall to the floor in a puddle of ruined expectations. The tunic and breeches were indeed too large, but they were warm and clean, and that mattered more than fit. "I'm decent," she said when she'd finished. Dorian turned back, and something flickered in his expression as he took in her appearance and his clothing, but he said nothing about it, only gathered the wedding dress from the floor. "What are you doing?" Isla asked as he carried it toward the fire. "Burning evidence. If anyone searches again, finding that would be unfortunate." He paused, looking at her. "Unless you want to keep it?" Isla thought of what the dress represented. Torben's hands reaching for hers. The flood of knowledge about his intentions. The terror of feeling his pleasure in past murders, and anticipation of hers. "Burn it," she said firmly. Dorian fed the silk into the flames. It caught quickly, the delicate fabric consumed by fire that reduced it to ash and smoke. Isla watched it burn and felt something loosen in her chest. One connection to that nightmare severed. When the last of it had disappeared into the flames, Dorian returned to his stool. "You should rest more. Your body needs time to recover from the cold." Isla settled back into the bed, suddenly aware of how exhausted she still felt. But before she could drift off, curiosity made her ask one more question. "Why do you live up here? If you've been exiled for 8 years, you could have left these mountains. Gone somewhere no one would know you." Dorian was quiet for so long Isla thought he might not answer. Then he spoke, his voice carrying a weight of old pain. "These mountains are the only home I have left. The only place where I can be alone with my failures without dragging anyone else down with them." The raw honesty of that statement resonated with something in Isla's chest. She understood failure, understood the weight of disappointment and shame, understood the desire to disappear where no one could see you break. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Dorian looked at her, surprise evident in his gray eyes. "For what? Whatever happened to bring you here? Whatever injustice led to 8 years of isolation?" He studied her for a long moment, and Isla had the strange sense that he was seeing her clearly for the first time, looking past the circumstances of her arrival to the person underneath. "Get some rest," he said finally, his voice gentler than before. "We can talk more when you're stronger." Isla closed her eyes, letting exhaustion pull her down into sleep. But as consciousness faded, she thought about the man across the room, about the loneliness she'd sensed in him despite his kindness, about the way he'd protected her without asking anything in return, and she wondered what truth she might discover about Dorian if she allowed herself to stay long enough to find out. Chapter 3. Scarred Truths. The storm raged for 4 days. Isla woke each morning to the howl of wind against stone walls, to snow falling so thick the world beyond the cabin's single window became nothing more than swirling white. The temperature dropped so low that frost formed on the inside of the door, delicate patterns of ice that Dorian scraped away each morning before venturing out to check his snares. They fell into a rhythm born of necessity. Dorian disappeared before dawn to hunt and gather firewood, returning hours later with game or fish and arms loaded with wood to feed the constantly burning fire. Isla took over the cabin's domestic maintenance, cooking the meals, organizing provisions, mending a tear in one of the furs with a bone needle she found in a wooden box. It felt strange, this domestic arrangement with a man who was essentially a stranger. Yet it also felt natural in ways Isla didn't want to examine too closely. Dorian moved through the space with quiet consideration, always aware of where she was, giving her room to breathe while still maintaining enough presence that she never felt abandoned or unsafe. On the second day, as Isla prepared rabbit stew over the fire, she asked, "How long have you lived here?" Dorian looked up from where he was cleaning his hunting knife. 8 years. "Since the exile? Alone the entire time?" "Yes." He tested the blade's edge against his thumb, then resumed sharpening. "It's easier that way." Isla stirred the pot, watching vegetables bob in the simmering broth. "Easier than what?" "Than pretending I'm someone worth knowing." The bitterness in his voice startled her. She glanced at him, but he'd turned his attention fully to his work, effectively closing the conversation. By the 3rd day, Isla had begun to notice things about Dorian that didn't fit the image of a simple, exiled hunter. The way he spoke, for instance. His vocabulary was too refined, his grammar too precise. These were the speech patterns of someone educated, Someone who'd been trained in courtly manners before exile stripped away the need for such refinements. And the way he moved. Isla had grown up around warriors, had watched her father train before the border wars claimed his life. Dorian moved with that same controlled grace, economical and purposeful. He held his knife the way soldiers held weapons, familiar and competent. When he split firewood, each swing of the axe demonstrated strength tempered by years of martial training. "You weren't always a hunter," Isla said on the fourth morning, watching him prepare to venture out into the storm again. Dorian paused in pulling on his heavy cloak. "What makes you say that? The way you carry yourself. The way you speak. You were trained for something else before you came here." He studied her for a long moment, those gray eyes assessing. "You're observant. You already said that." "It bears repeating." He finished securing the cloak and picked up his bow. "What I was before doesn't matter. This is what I am now." He left before she could press further, disappearing into the white curtain of falling snow. That night, the nightmare came. Isla had fallen asleep on the bed while Dorian sat by the fire, reading from a worn book she'd noticed on one of the shelves. She'd been surprised to find books in a mountain cabin, but Dorian had simply shrugged when she'd commented on it. "A man needs something to occupy his mind during long winters," he'd said. "Books serve that purpose well enough." The nightmare dragged her back to the great hall, to the moment Torben's hand had closed around hers. But in the dream, she couldn't pull away. She was trapped in that connection, drowning in the flood of his intentions. She felt his previous wives dying, felt their terror and pain as if it were her own, felt Torben's satisfaction, his pleasure, his eager anticipation of adding her to that collection. She woke screaming, thrashing against the furs that suddenly felt like restraining hands. "Isla," Dorian's voice cut through the panic, steady and calm. "Isla, you're safe. You're in the cabin. It was a dream." She gasped for air, her heart hammering so hard it hurt. Dorian stood beside the bed, careful not to touch her, but close enough that his presence anchored her to reality. "I'm sorry," she managed, pressing shaking hands to her face. "I didn't mean to. Don't apologize for nightmares." He moved to the water bucket and returned with a filled cup. "Here, drink." Isla accepted it gratefully, the cold water shocking her fully back to wakefulness. When she'd drained half the cup, she set it aside and drew her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. "Do you want to talk about it?" Dorian asked quietly. The question surprised her. Most people, particularly men, avoided discussions of fear or vulnerability, but Dorian simply waited, his expression patient and without judgment. "It was the ceremony," Isla admitted. "When I touched Torben's hand." "What happened when you touched him?" Isla hesitated, unsure how to explain something she barely understood herself. But the nightmare had left her raw and vulnerable, and the words spilled out before she could second-guess sharing them. "I felt things. Saw things. Not with my eyes, but in my mind. Memories, emotions, intentions. His previous wives, the way they died. And his enjoyment of it. His anticipation of doing the same to me." She looked up at Dorian, needing him to understand. "That's why I ran. Not because I was afraid of marriage or duty. Because I knew, with absolute certainty, that he would kill me. Eventually, after he'd finished enjoying my fear." Dorian's entire body had gone rigid as she spoke. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and something dark and dangerous flickered across his features. "Torben," he said, the name emerging like a curse. "I know his reputation. 3 dead wives, all ruled accidents or natural causes, but everyone knows the truth. The Alphas tolerate him because his territory is wealthy and his warriors are well trained." "You believe me?" Isla asked, surprised. "You don't think I'm making excuses for abandoning my duty? Duty doesn't include walking willingly into murder." Dorian's voice carried an edge sharp as broken glass. "And yes, I believe you. I've met men like Torben. The kind who view others as things to be used and discarded. The kind who enjoy causing suffering." The way he said it suggested personal experience. Isla wondered what Dorian had encountered during his life before exile that had taught him to recognize cruelty so readily. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his arm. The contact sent a jolt through her, and suddenly she was feeling what he felt. Rage, burning hot and protective, directed at Torben and every man like him. Beneath that, a layer of old pain, wounds that hadn't healed despite 8 years of isolation. And deeper still, something else. Something that called to the hollow places inside her chest, with a recognition she couldn't name. Dorian looked down at where her hand rested on his forearm, his expression shifting through surprise to something more complex. "I'm sorry," Isla said, starting to pull back. "I didn't mean to," but Dorian caught her hand, holding it gently. "Don't apologize." His thumb brushed across her knuckles, the gesture achingly tender. "I'm the one who should apologize. You've been through trauma, and here I am getting angry on your behalf, when what you probably need is reassurance." "Your anger helps," Isla admitted. "It means you believe me, that you don't think I'm crazy for sensing what I did." "You're not crazy." Dorian's gray eyes met hers, intense and unwavering. "Whatever you felt from him was real. I'd stake my life on it." The certainty in his voice did something to Isla's composure. Tears burned at the back of her throat, threatening to spill. She'd been so afraid that no one would believe her, that they'd dismiss her flight as hysteria or cold feet. But Dorian believed without question, and that validation meant more than she knew how to express. One tear escaped, sliding down her cheek. Dorian reached up with his free hand and brushed it away, his touch careful and reverent. The moment stretched between them, charged with something Isla couldn't quite identify. The fire crackled in the hearth. Wind howled against the walls, and Dorian's hand remained cupped against her cheek, his thumb tracing the path of that single tear. Then he pulled back abruptly, as if he'd suddenly realized how close they'd become. He stood and moved toward the fire, putting distance between them. "You should try to sleep more," he said, his voice rougher than before. "The storm should break tomorrow. You'll need your strength." But as he turned, the movement pulling his shirt tight across his back, Isla saw something that made her breath catch. Even through the fabric, she could make out the texture of old scars, a network of raised lines that covered his upper back and shoulders. "Dorian," she said quietly, "your scars. What happened?" His shoulders tensed, every line of his body going rigid. "It's nothing. That's not nothing. Those are whip marks, public punishment scars." He didn't turn around, didn't face her. "You should sleep, Isla. Tell me." She pushed herself off the bed, moving closer though she didn't dare touch him again. "You said you were exiled for refusing an Alpha's order, but you didn't mention being flogged first." "Because it's not relevant. It's relevant to me." Isla moved around to face him, forcing him to look at her. "You've protected me, sheltered me, believed me when no one else would. The least I can do is listen if you want to talk about whatever put those scars on your back." Dorian's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking in his cheek. For a long moment, she thought he'd refuse entirely. Then he spoke, each word carefully measured. "The Alpha I served demanded something of me that went against every code I was raised to honor. When I refused, he made an example of me. 50 lashes in the public square, followed by exile with orders that returning would mean execution." His eyes were distant, focused on memories she couldn't see. "The scars are a reminder that honor has a price, and sometimes that price is everything you thought you were." The bitterness and shame radiating from him hit Isla like a physical force. Even without touching him, she could feel the weight of old wounds that had nothing to do with his scarred back, and everything to do with his scarred soul. "Honor isn't defined by the people who punish it," Isla said softly. "Sometimes the most honorable thing you can do is refuse orders that would make you into someone you're not." Dorian looked at her then, really looked at her, and Isla saw something crack in his carefully maintained walls. "You're very wise for someone so young. I'm 22, old enough to know that cruelty exists, and old enough to recognize courage when I see it. Is that what you see when you look at me? Courage?" His laugh held no humor. "I see failure. A man who couldn't navigate the politics of his position, who valued his own moral code over practical survival, and who's paid for that pride with 8 years of isolation. I see someone who chose integrity over comfort," Isla countered. Someone who'd rather live alone with a clear conscience than thrive while compromising his values. That's not failure, Dorian. That's strength. He stared at her, something shifting in his expression. The air between them felt charged again, heavy with things neither of them was quite ready to name. You should sleep, he said finally, but his voice had gentled. Tomorrow the storm breaks, and we'll need to decide what comes next. Isla returned to the bed, but sleep was a long time coming. She lay awake listening to the storm's fury gradually diminish, thinking about the man across the cabin who carried scars both visible and hidden, thinking about the way his touch had felt, the way his belief in her had shored up foundations she hadn't realized were crumbling, and wondering what it meant that she could feel his emotions like echoes of her own, that the space between them hummed with a connection she'd never experienced before. Chapter 4. Blood and Belonging. The storm broke on the 5th morning, leaving the world wrapped in pristine white silence. Isla woke to sunlight streaming through the cabin's window for the first time since her arrival, the brightness almost painful after days of gray gloom. Dorian was already awake, standing by the door with his bow and quiver. He looked over when he heard her stirring, and something in his expression had changed. Not wariness exactly, but a careful distance that hadn't existed the night before. "The weather has cleared," he said. "I thought I'd check the traps. Maybe hunt if the game has started moving again. You're welcome to come if you want to learn the trails." The offer surprised Isla. She'd expected him to suggest she prepare for departure now that the storm had passed, not invite her deeper into his solitary existence. "I'd like that," she said, pushing aside the furs and standing. The borrowed clothes had become familiar over the past days, comfortable in ways her previous life's formal garments had never been. They set out an hour later, Isla wearing an extra cloak Dorian had produced from his chest, and sturdy boots he'd padded with wool scraps to fit her smaller feet. The snow came up to her knees in places, making each step an effort. But Dorian moved ahead of her with practiced ease, breaking trail. "Watch how the deer move through here," he said, pointing to tracks that crossed their path. "See how they follow the ridgeline where the snow is shallower? They're conserving energy, choosing the easiest routes between feeding grounds." Isla studied the delicate hoofprints, trying to see the patterns he described. "How do you know they're going to feed rather than coming from it?" "The spacing of the tracks. When deer are hungry, they move with more purpose, longer strides. After feeding, they wander more, stop to investigate things." He knelt beside the trail, brushing snow away to reveal disturbed earth beneath. "This doe stopped here to dig for browse. She was successful. See the scratch marks?" The way he explained it made sense, transforming random marks in snow into a readable story. Isla found herself leaning closer, genuinely curious. They continued on, Dorian pointing out other signs. The scrape marks where a buck had rubbed velvet from his antlers. The distinctive tunnel a fox had dug to reach a rodent's winter cache. The claw marks high on a tree trunk where a bear had stretched before denning for winter. "You see everything," Isla observed as they paused to rest on a fallen log. "Most people would just see snow and trees. Survival requires observation. The forest tells you what it needs you to know, but only if you're paying attention." Dorian handed her his water skin, and their fingers brushed in the exchange. The contact sent that now familiar jolt through Isla, and suddenly she was feeling what he felt. Contentment at being out in the wild, pride in teaching her, in watching her learn, and beneath that, something warmer, more complex, an awareness of her presence beside him that went beyond simple companionship. She pulled her hand back quickly, the sensation overwhelming. Dorian watched her with those gray eyes that seemed to see too much. "It happens more frequently now, doesn't it?" he asked quietly. "The sensing." Isla nodded, unsure how much to admit. "Since we've been in close quarters, I can feel emotions sometimes, even without touching. Yours are the strongest, but I can sense smaller things too. The cabin itself almost has a presence, years of your solitude soaked into the walls. Is it painful? Overwhelming? Sometimes. But not with you." The admission came easier than it should have. "Your emotions are intense, but they're not cruel. They don't hurt to feel." Dorian's expression shifted, something vulnerable flickering across his features before he looked away. We should keep moving. I want to check the northern snares before we lose the light. They walked in silence for a while, following game trails through evergreen groves heavy with snow. The peace of it settled into Isla's bones, replacing the constant anxiety that had defined her life in her uncle's pack. Here, in this frozen wilderness with a man who barely knew her, she felt safer than she'd felt in years. "Your scars," she said finally, as they stopped to examine a snare that had been tripped but was empty. "You said you were punished for refusing an order. But there's more to it than that, isn't there? Something you're not saying." Dorian's hands stilled on the snare's mechanism. "Why do you think that?" "Because when I touched you last night, I felt layers. The punishment, the exile, those are surface truths. But beneath them, there's something deeper. Family, betrayal, expectations you couldn't meet or chose not to meet." Isla moved closer, watching his face. "You weren't just some warrior who disobeyed orders. You were someone important, weren't you?" He didn't answer immediately. His attention focused on resetting the snare with meticulous care. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "I was born to a servant woman in a great house. The lord of that house took certain liberties, and I was the result. My mother died when I was 10, leaving me alone among people who saw me as both less than them, and uncomfortably more." He stood, dusting snow from his hands. "I was trained alongside his legitimate sons, given weapons instruction and education, but never acknowledged, never treated as equal. Half-siblings," Isla said, understanding dawning. "That's why you mentioned brothers earlier, then stopped yourself. 3 of them, all older, all legitimate heirs to their father's position. They tolerated my presence because their father insisted, but they never accepted me as family." Something bitter crossed his expression. "When the oldest died 8 years ago, supposedly in battle, everything changed. Suddenly I was useful. A potential replacement for an heir that couldn't be replaced." The way he said supposedly caught Isla's attention, but before she could ask about it, Dorian was moving again, striding through the snow with renewed purpose. They checked 2 more snares, finding a rabbit in the 3rd. Dorian dispatched it quickly and humanely, then added it to the pack he carried. The sun had begun its descent toward the western peaks, painting the snow in shades of gold and pink. "We should head back," Dorian said. "The temperature drops fast once the sun sets." The return journey felt different, charged with the weight of partial truths and unasked questions. Isla wanted to press for more details, to understand the full story of what had brought Dorian to 8 years of isolation. But she recognized the walls he'd raised, the careful distance he was maintaining. They reached the cabin as twilight deepened into night. Dorian built up the fire while Isla prepared the rabbit for cooking, their movements synchronized from days of shared space. "Tell me about your childhood," Isla said, as they ate the meal she'd made, roasted rabbit with herbs Dorian had hanging from the cabin's rafters. "Before everything went wrong, what was it like?" Dorian was quiet for so long she thought he might refuse. Then he began speaking, his voice taking on a distant quality as he retrieved memories he'd clearly tried to bury. "I remember sword practice in a courtyard paved with white stone. My instructor was a retired warrior named Gavril, and he was harder on me than on my half-brothers, because he said I needed to be twice as good to be considered half as worthy." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. He was right. "I learned to fight with everything I had, every day, until I was the best among us." "Did that change how they treated you?" Isla asked. "No. If anything, it made things worse. My father, the Lord, he started paying more attention to me. Started talking about responsibility and duty and the importance of family loyalty." Dorian's hands clenched around his cup. "My brothers saw it as a threat. They went from ignoring me to actively working against me. Small cruelties and larger betrayals, all designed to remind me of my place." Isla could hear the pain beneath his carefully neutral tone, could feel it radiating from him despite the space between them. "But you stayed. You didn't leave." "Where would I go? I was young, and despite everything, part of me still hoped I might earn my father's recognition, might become someone worth acknowledging." He set his cup down with more force than necessary. That hope was foolish. "What changed?" Isla asked gently. "What happened to make him exile you?" But Dorian shook his head. That's a story for another time. It's late, and we both need rest. He stood, clearly intending to end the conversation, but Isla rose too, frustration bubbling up. You can't keep doing this, telling me pieces but never the whole truth. You know everything about why I'm here, what I'm running from. But you give me fragments and expect me to accept that. It's better if you don't know everything, Dorian said, his back to her as he faced the fire. Better if you don't get too close to understanding what I am. What you are. You're a man who was treated poorly by people who should have protected you. A man who chose honor over expedience and was punished for it. That's what I see, Dorian. He turned then, and the look in his eyes stole her breath. Raw and vulnerable and yearning all at once. You see what you want to see. You don't see the truth of my bloodline, the way it taints everything it touches. Then tell me, Isla said, closing the distance between them. Tell me the truth instead of hiding behind vague warnings. I can't. The words came out rough, almost desperate. I can't burden you with knowledge that could destroy you. I'm already destroyed. Isla shot back. I'm an exile with nowhere to go. No pack, no family. What more could your truth possibly take from me? Dorian stared at her, something breaking in his expression. Then suddenly his hands were cupping her face, and he was kissing her with an intensity that drove the air from her lungs. The world exploded into sensation. His lips were firm but gentle, moving against hers with a hunger that spoke of years of isolation and denied connection. Isla's hands came up to grip his shirt, holding on as everything she thought she understood tilted sideways. And beneath the physical sensation, something else bloomed. A connection that went deeper than touch, deeper than desire. It felt like recognition, like two parts of a broken whole suddenly finding each other. The mate bond, Isla realized distantly, snapping into place with a force that made her gasp against his mouth. Dorian pulled back abruptly, his breathing ragged. His eyes had gone wide, showing whites like a spooked horse. No, he said, backing away from her. No, this can't happen. You need to leave, Isla. Tomorrow at dawn you need to go. What? Confusion and hurt warred in Isla's chest. You can't just kiss me like that and then... I'm dangerous for you in ways you don't understand. Dorian's voice had gone hard, desperate. That bond you felt, that connection, it's real. But it's also a curse. Everyone I've ever cared about has suffered for it. That's not... My mother died because she loved my father. My mentor was executed for training me too well. The one woman I cared about before my exile was married off to an enemy pack to remove her from my influence. His hands were shaking, Isla noticed. Actually shaking. I won't do that to you. I won't let my blood condemn you too. Isla's mind reeled, trying to process everything. The kiss. The bond. The vehement rejection wrapped in what sounded horrifyingly like care. You don't get to decide that for me, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. You don't get to kiss me? Let me feel what's between us, and then push me away because you're afraid. It's not fear. It's certainty. Dorian moved to the far side of the cabin, putting maximum distance between them. Go to sleep, Isla. At dawn, I'll take you down to the villages. You can find another pack, another life, one that doesn't include me and the destruction my bloodline brings. He turned his back, shoulders rigid with tension, clearly done with the conversation. Isla stood trembling in the firelight, her lips still burning from his kiss, the mate bond thrumming in her chest like a second heartbeat. Everything had changed in the span of a few heartbeats, and she didn't know how to change it back. She didn't know if she wanted to. Chapter 5. Royal Blood. Dawn came cold and gray, the sun hidden behind banks of low clouds that promised more snow. Isla woke to find Dorian already dressed, packing supplies into a leather satchel with methodical precision. He didn't look at her when she stirred. I meant what I said last night, he said, his voice flat. You need to leave. I'll guide you down to the lower valleys where you can find shelter in one of the villages. Isla pushed herself upright, anger cutting through the confusion and hurt that had kept her awake most of the night. No, that made him pause. He turned to face her, his gray eyes shadowed. This isn't a negotiation, Isla. For your own safety. My safety. She stood, crossing the cabin to stand before him, You felt that bond snap into place same as I did. You can't just pretend it didn't happen because you're afraid. I'm not afraid, I'm realistic. Dorian's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking in his cheek. You have no idea what being connected to me means. What dangers it brings. Then tell me. Isla grabbed his arm, forcing him to meet her eyes. Stop hiding behind vague warnings and tell me the truth. All of it. You want the truth? Something broke in his expression, fury and desperation warring across his features. Fine. My father is Alpha King Varian, ruler of the Northern Territories. I'm his bastard son, born to a servant he used and discarded. I spent my entire childhood watching him ignore my existence, while my legitimate half-brothers tormented me for daring to breathe the same air. And when his heir died 8 years ago, supposedly in battle, he tried to turn me into a replacement, a political tool to be married off and used to secure alliances I wanted no part of. The words came out harsh and bitter, each one landing like a blow. Isla's hand tightened on his arm, feeling the truth of it resonating through their connection. I refused, Dorian continued, his voice rough. Told him I wouldn't be his puppet, wouldn't marry some alpha's daughter I'd never met just to satisfy his political ambitions. So he had me flogged in the public square, 50 lashes while the entire court watched. Then he exiled me here with orders that returning would mean execution. He pulled free of her grip, pacing away. This cabin? It's royal property, an old hunting lodge that hasn't been used in decades. He knew exactly where I was, has always known. He just didn't care as long as I stayed invisible. Isla processed the information, pieces clicking into place. The education, the military training, the way he carried himself, all of it made sense now. And now? She asked quietly. What's changed? I don't know. Maybe he's finally run out of legitimate options. Maybe the sound of horses outside cut him off. Multiple animals, their hooves crunching through snow at a steady pace. Dorian's entire body went rigid, his hand moving instinctively toward the hunting knife at his belt. Stay behind me, he ordered, moving to the door. Before Isla could respond, someone knocked. 3 sharp raps, formal and official. Dorian opened the door to reveal 5 soldiers mounted on war horses, their armor bearing the royal crest. At their head sat a man perhaps 40 years old, his weathered face stern beneath graying hair. His eyes swept the cabin's interior, pausing briefly on Isla before returning to Dorian. Commander Oren, Dorian said, his voice carefully neutral. It's been a long time. 8 years. Oren dismounted, his movements deliberate. May I come in? The message I carry isn't for public hearing. Dorian stepped aside, allowing the commander to enter. Oren's soldiers remained mounted outside, watchful and silent. Inside, Oren removed his gloves slowly, his attention fixed on Dorian. Alpha King Varian sends his summons. You're to return to the capital immediately. I'm exiled, Dorian said flatly. Returning means death. Those were his terms. Terms he's chosen to revoke. Oren pulled a sealed parchment from inside his cloak, offering it to Dorian. You're needed at court. He didn't elaborate on why, only that your presence is required within the fortnight. Dorian didn't take the parchment. And if I refuse? Something shifted in Oren's expression, a flash of genuine regret. Then he'll execute Maren, the woman who raised you after your mother died. He has her in the dungeons, Dorian. She's 70 years old, and he'll kill her if you don't come. The color drained from Dorian's face. He wouldn't. You know he would. Oren's voice gentled slightly. He's desperate, though I don't know why. But he's willing to use whatever leverage he has. I'm sorry. Isla watched Dorian's hands clench into fists, his entire body vibrating with suppressed rage. She could feel it through their connection, a storm of fury and helplessness. Maren has nothing to do with any of this, Dorian said, his voice dangerously quiet. She's an old woman who showed kindness to a child who had no one. Threatening her is effective, Oren interrupted, which is why he's doing it. You have 3 days to reach the capital, Dorian. After that, he starts taking fingers. The casual way Oren delivered the threat made Isla's stomach turn. This was the Alpha King, Dorian's father, casually threatening to torture an innocent old woman to force his bastard son's compliance. Oren's gaze shifted to Isla, and something calculating entered his expression. I recognize that hair, those eyes. You're the Omega who fled Lord Torben's wedding ceremony a week ago. There's a substantial reward for your return. Fear spiked through Isla, but Dorian moved before she could react, positioning himself between her and Oren. Don't, Dorian said, and there was something in his voice that made the commander's hand move away from his sword hilt. You're protecting her. Oren's eyes narrowed. Why? Because she doesn't deserve to be delivered to a murderer. Lord Torben is a powerful alpha. Accusing him without proof. She has proof, Dorian interrupted. She touched him and felt his intentions. Felt his memories of killing 3 women and his plans for a 4th. She ran to save her life, not from duty. Oren was quiet for a long moment, studying Isla with new attention. You're a truth seeker. It wasn't a question. Isla nodded slowly, uncertain where this was leading. Rare gift, Oren mused. Haven't seen one in 20 years. Last woman who had it ended up advising the council until she died. His attention returned to Dorian. If I report her location, Torben will send men. They'll drag her back and her gift won't save her once she's in his territory. I know. So you want me to lie. To fail in my duty and tell Lord Torben I found no trace of his runaway bride. I want you to remember the man you were before you became Varian's dog, Dorian said. And Isla heard old friendship beneath the harsh words. I want you to remember that we trained together, fought together, that you once told me you'd never serve a king who demanded cruelty over justice. Oren's jaw tightened. That was before your exile, before I learned what happens to people who question orders. And yet you're here delivering his summons personally instead of sending a subordinate. Why, Oren? What is it you're not saying? The commander was silent for several heartbeats. Then he sighed, suddenly looking older. Because I wanted to warn you. Your father, he's not the same as he was 8 years ago. Something's changed. He's more paranoid, more willing to hurt people to get what he wants. I don't know what he plans for you, but I don't think it ends well. Then help me, Dorian said quietly. Keep Isla's location secret. Give me your word as the man I once called friend that you won't report her. And what do I get in return? I'll go. I'll return to the capital, face whatever my father has planned. I'll walk into that trap willingly if you swear by the old codes that you'll protect her. Oren studied Dorian's face, then Isla's, calculation visible in his weathered features. Finally, he nodded. By the old codes, the honor of the guard, I swear I won't reveal her location. As far as official reports are concerned, I found no trace of Lord Torben's missing bride. He held out his arm, and Dorian clasped it in the traditional warrior's grip. But Dorian, if your father asks directly, I can't lie to the Alpha King. I can omit, but not fabricate. Understood. Dorian released his arm. When do we leave? Within the hour. The journey to the capital takes 2 days in good weather, and the king's deadline doesn't allow for delays. Oren moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. About Maren. About all of this. You deserved better. After Oren left to give his men instructions, Dorian turned to Isla. The mask he'd maintained for the commander crumbled, revealing raw pain beneath. I have to go, he said. I can't let them hurt Maren because of me. I know. Isla crossed to him, taking his hands in hers despite his attempt to pull away. But I'm not leaving. I'll stay here. Wait for you to return. Isla, that's not... You're my mate, she interrupted. That bond we felt, it's real. And I'm not abandoning you just because things got complicated. Dorian's expression twisted with something that might have been hope and fear combined. I might not come back. My father, whatever he wants from me, it won't be anything good. Then I'll come find you. The certainty in her voice seemed to shake something loose in him. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. You're going to be the death of me, Omega. No, Isla said firmly. I'm going to be the reason you survive. Dorian packed quickly, taking only essentials. He showed Isla where he kept the food stores, how to maintain the fire, where the emergency supplies were hidden. There's wood enough for 2 weeks if you're careful, he said, his hands moving automatically through familiar tasks. Game should return to the area soon now that the storm's passed. The snares are easy to check. I'll be fine, Isla assured him, though uncertainty gnawed at her. Just come back. At the door, Dorian paused. He turned back, cupped her face in his hands, and kissed her with desperate intensity. The mate bond flared between them, a golden thread binding them even as physical distance was about to separate them. I don't know what waits for me in the capital, he said against her lips. But knowing you're here, safe, that gives me a reason to survive whatever comes. Then he was gone, mounting the horse Oren had brought for him. Isla watched from the doorway as the soldiers disappeared into the trees, Dorian never looking back. The cabin felt impossibly empty in his absence. Isla closed the door and leaned against it, her hand pressed to her chest where the mate bond pulsed with growing distance. She'd told Dorian she would wait, but even as she said it, Isla knew she was lying. She would wait only long enough to form a plan, because if Dorian thought she would sit here passively while his father used him as a political tool, he severely underestimated what a desperate Omega with a rare gift could do. Chapter 6. The Truth Seeker's Path. Isla lasted 2 days in the cabin before the mate bond became unbearable. It started as a whisper at the edge of her awareness, a sense of Dorian's presence like warmth against her skin, despite the distance between them. But as hours passed, that whisper grew louder, more insistent. She could feel his emotions bleeding through their connection. Anxiety and anger, and something darker, betrayal. He was in danger. On the 3rd morning after his departure, Isla woke to a spike of pain through the bond so sharp it drove the breath from her lungs. Not physical pain, emotional. The kind that came from discovering treachery from someone trusted. She was on her feet before conscious thought caught up, throwing supplies into the pack Dorian had left behind. She couldn't sit here doing nothing while her mate walked into whatever trap his father had prepared. The promise to wait meant nothing against the certainty pulsing through their connection that Dorian needed her. The descent from the mountains proved harder than she'd anticipated. Snow still lay thick on the ground, and without Dorian breaking trail, each step required monumental effort. But he'd taught her well during their hunting trip. She followed game trails where the snow was shallower, used fallen logs as bridges across deep drifts, and kept the sun at her right shoulder to maintain a southward trajectory. By midday, her legs burned, and her lungs ached from the cold air, but the trees were changing. Evergreens giving way to mixed forest, the terrain gradually flattening. She was making progress. As twilight approached, Isla spotted smoke rising in the distance. A village, small but substantial enough to support multiple hearths. She adjusted her course, moving toward the promise of shelter and information. The village consisted of perhaps 20 buildings clustered around a central square. An inn stood at one end, warm light spilling from its windows. Isla pushed through the door, grateful for the wave of heat that greeted her. Inside, the common room was half full, locals nursing drinks and sharing the day's gossip. Isla found a corner table and ordered stew and ale from a serving girl who barely glanced at her. She ate slowly, listening to conversations flowing around her. Most of it was mundane, complaints about the weather and speculation about spring planting. But then 2 men at the bar began speaking in lowered voices that somehow carried to where Isla sat. Heard it from a merchant who passed through the capital yesterday, one said, a grizzled man with more beard than face. The Alpha King has summoned his bastard son back. First time in 8 years. His companion, younger and clean-shaven, snorted. That exile? What does Varian want with him after all this time? Same thing he wanted before, I reckon. Political marriage, secure an alliance. Only this time the bastard can't refuse without watching that old nursemaid of his lose fingers. Isla's hand clenched around her spoon. Marin. Dorian had mentioned her. The woman who'd raised him after his mother died. Cruel. Even for Varian, the younger man muttered. Gets worse, the bearded one continued, leaning closer. Word is, the king doesn't plan on keeping the boy alive long after he names an heir. Apparently, Varian's paranoid about anyone with a blood claim challenging his authority. Soon as the bastard sires a child with whichever Alpha's daughter they force on him, he's a liability. Cold dread settled in Isla's stomach. Execution. Varian planned to use Dorian and then kill him. That's murder, the younger man said, shocked. That's politics. The bastard refused him once before, made the king look weak. Varian doesn't forgive that kind of insult. Isla set down her spoon, no longer hungry. She had to reach the capital, had to find a way to stop this. But she was one Omega with no pack, no resources, no authority. How could she possibly intervene in royal politics? The answer came as she remembered her mother's stories. Tales of the pack her mother had been born into before marrying Isla's father and joining his smaller, less influential group. Her grandmother still lived there, her mother had said. Lady Rhiannon, a woman of considerable respect and authority. It was a gamble. Isla had never met her grandmother, didn't know if the woman would even acknowledge her, but it was the only option she had. She finished her meal and approached the innkeeper, a stout woman with shrewd eyes. I need directions to the Silverpine territory, Lady Rhiannon's packlands. The innkeeper's eyebrows rose. That's 2 days' ride east. You got business with the lady? I'm her granddaughter. That earned her a long, assessing look. Then the innkeeper nodded slowly. You've got the look of her, now that I see it proper. Same eyes, same stubborn chin. She pulled out a worn map, tracing a route with one thick finger. Follow the eastern road through Oakenvale, then north at the crossroads. Silverpine lands start at the stone markers. You'll know them when you see them. Isla purchased a horse with the last of the coins she'd found in Dorian's cabin. Money he'd probably forgotten about in a wooden box beneath the bed. The mare was older but steady, and she carried Isla through 2 days of hard riding with patient determination. The Silverpine territory announced itself with carved stone pillars flanking the road, each bearing the pack's crest, a crescent moon above 3 pine trees. Guards stopped her at the border, professional and courteous as they questioned her purpose. I need to speak with Lady Rhiannon, Isla said, sitting straighter in her saddle despite exhaustion. I'm Isla, daughter of her deceased daughter Moira. It's urgent. The guards exchanged glances. One rode ahead, while the other escorted Isla deeper into packlands. The buildings here were well maintained, prosperity evident in clean streets and healthy livestock. This was a pack that thrived, not one scraping by on the edge of survival like her uncle's had been. The pack house was magnificent, built of pale stone that seemed to glow in the afternoon light. Isla was led to a receiving room where she was told to wait. Lady Rhiannon entered minutes later, and Isla's breath caught. The woman was perhaps 70, her hair silver white and braided into an elegant crown. But her eyes, those were exactly like Isla's own, amber green and sharp with intelligence. So, Rhiannon said, studying Isla with undisguised curiosity. My daughter's child. I wondered if you'd ever seek me out. You knew about me? Isla asked, surprised. Of course. I may have disapproved of Moira marrying into such a weak pack, but I kept track of her daughter. Rhiannon moved to a chair, gesturing for Isla to sit. Your Uncle Garrick contacted me when you fled Lord Torben's wedding. Wanted to know if you'd come here. I told him no, truthfully, though I wished you had. Relief flooded through Isla. Then you know why I ran. I know Torben's reputation. I know you likely saved your own life by fleeing. Rhiannon's expression hardened. What I don't know is why you're here now instead of safely hidden wherever you've been these past weeks. Isla took a breath and explained everything. The cabin, Dorian, the mate bond, his identity as the Alpha King's bastard son, and the trap waiting for him in the capital. When she finished, Rhiannon was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, You're a truth seeker. It wasn't a question. Isla nodded. I can feel emotions. Sometimes see memories when I touch people. With Torben, I felt his intentions to kill me. With Dorian, I feel everything he feels through our bond. It's more than that, Rhiannon said. Your gift is one recognized by the oldest laws. A truth seeker can invoke the right of challenge in formal court proceedings. You can force truth to the surface, make it visible to all witnesses. It's a rare gift, Isla, one that carries considerable weight in legal disputes. Hope sparked in Isla's chest. Could I use it to help Dorian? Possibly. If you can reach the capital in time, if you can invoke challenge before they execute him, and if whatever truths you reveal are damning enough to the Alpha King. Rhiannon stood, pacing. It's dangerous. Varian doesn't take well to being challenged. I don't care about danger. I care about saving my mate. Rhiannon studied her for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. You have your mother's courage. And her stubbornness. She moved to pull a cord that summoned a servant. We'll need to move quickly. I'll provide an escort, 3 of my best warriors. And I'll come myself as witness to validate your gift. You'd do that? Isla asked, hardly daring to believe. You're my granddaughter, my blood, and I never approved of how Garrick used you as payment for his debts. Rhiannon's eyes hardened. Besides, I've wanted an excuse to tell Alpha King Varian exactly what I think of his politics for years. This provides an excellent opportunity. Within hours, Isla found herself mounted on a fresh horse, surrounded by 3 massive warriors in Silverpine colors. Lady Rhiannon rode at her side, regal and commanding despite her age. Before they departed, Isla sent a message to her uncle through one of Rhiannon's messengers. Simple and final. You sold me to a murderer. I am no longer your niece. Consider our ties severed. The journey to the capital took 2 hard days of riding. With each mile, Isla felt Dorian through their bond, his emotions a churning storm of anger and resignation. He was alive, but barely holding on to hope. They reached the capital the evening before the day Isla had overheard mentioned in the tavern. The day Varian planned to force Dorian's compliance before arranging his eventual death. We'll rest tonight, Rhiannon said, as they entered the city through the western gate. Tomorrow, you'll invoke your right as Truth Seeker, and we'll see if the Alpha King can withstand having his secrets laid bare before his entire court. Isla touched her chest, feeling the mate bond pulse with renewed strength. Dorian was close now, somewhere in this sprawling city, and tomorrow, she would fight for him the only way she knew how, with truth as her weapon and courage as her shield. Chapter 7. Truth Unveiled. The great hall of the royal palace was packed beyond capacity. Nobles and warriors pressed shoulder to shoulder in a space designed to hold hundreds, but now containing what felt like thousands. Isla stood at the threshold, Lady Rhiannon at her side, and felt the weight of every eye turning toward them. The hall itself was magnificent, all soaring stone arches and stained glass windows that cast colored light across the assembled crowd. At the far end, elevated on a dais of white marble, sat Alpha King Varian on a throne carved from a single massive oak. He was exactly as Dorian had described him, golden-haired, blue-eyed, radiating authority, and controlled menace in equal measure. And beside the throne, flanked by armed guards, stood Dorian. The mate bond flared at the sight of him, and Isla had to force herself not to run toward him. He looked thinner than he had a week ago, his face drawn with exhaustion and stress. But when his gray eyes found hers across the crowded hall, something shifted in his expression. Shock, followed by fear, followed by something that might have been hope. Lady Rhiannon of Silverpine, a herald announced, his voice carrying through the space. And her granddaughter, Isla, formerly of the Oak Hollow Pack. The crowd parted reluctantly as they made their way forward. Isla kept her spine straight, her chin lifted, refusing to show the terror churning in her stomach. Rhiannon walked with the confidence of someone who'd faced down kings before, and found them wanting. They stopped at the base of the dais. Varian studied them with cold interest, his gaze lingering on Isla before shifting to Rhiannon. Lady Rhiannon, he said, his voice smooth as silk over steel. This is unexpected. What brings you to my court? Justice, Rhiannon replied simply. And truth. Varian's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Truth is what I determine within these walls. Not today. Rhiannon's voice carried to every corner of the hall. Today, I invoke the ancient right of challenge through truth. My granddaughter is a truth seeker, witnessed and validated. She claims the right to force truth in formal judgment. The hall erupted in whispers. Varian's hands clenched on the arms of his throne, the only outward sign of displeasure. The old laws haven't been invoked in decades, he said carefully. But they remain valid, Rhiannon countered. Unless you're prepared to declare yourself above the traditions that gave you your throne, it was a masterful trap. If Varian refused, he appeared tyrannical, dismissive of the very laws that legitimized his rule. If he accepted, he opened himself to whatever truths Isla might reveal. "Very well," Varian said, each word clipped. "I accept the challenge. Let the court witness." Isla's heart hammered as she climbed the dais steps. Dorian tried to move toward her, but the guards held him back. His eyes were desperate, silently begging her not to do this, not to put herself in danger. But Isla had already made her choice. She stood before Varian, this man who'd tortured his own son, who'd threatened an innocent old woman, who'd planned Dorian's death with casual cruelty. Up close, she could see the hardness in his face, the way his eyes held no warmth, no mercy. "You seek truth?" Varian asked quietly, for her ears alone. "Be careful what you find, girl. Some truths destroy the one who speaks them. Then we'll see who's destroyed," Isla replied. She reached out and placed her hand on his. The world didn't explode this time. It shattered, splintering into jagged shards of memory and intent that cut straight through Isla. It wasn't like touching Torben had been, a flood of memories and intentions. This was deeper, more violent. Varian's shields were stronger, his mind more disciplined. But Isla's gift, amplified by the mate bond's desperation to protect Dorian, tore through those shields like paper. And what lay beneath was monstrous. Images flooded Isla's consciousness, vivid and undeniable. A young man, golden-haired and laughing, Varian's legitimate son and heir. The people loved him, respected him, turned to him rather than his father for guidance and wisdom. And Varian, watching from the shadows, consumed by jealous rage at being eclipsed by his own child. The arranged accident wasn't an accident at all. Varian himself had sabotaged his son's armor before the supposed battle, had ensured the young heir rode into an ambush with defective equipment, had watched him die, and felt satisfaction rather than grief. Then, covering it up, blaming enemies, accepting condolences while planning how to use his bastard son as a replacement, a tool to secure alliances before disposing of him too, because Dorian was too honorable, too much like the son Varian had murdered, another potential threat to be eliminated once his usefulness ended. And more, the conspiracy with Torben, trading promises of land and power in exchange for eliminating a truth-seeker who might one day expose Varian's crimes, the casual cruelty of threatening Maren simply to force Dorian's compliance, the systematic destruction of anyone who'd ever shown Dorian genuine affection or loyalty. All of it poured from Varian into Isla, and through their connection, into every person in the hall. Because truth-seekers didn't just sense truth. They could make others feel it, experience it, know it with absolute certainty. The hall erupted in chaos. Nobles shouted in outrage, warriors drew weapons in confusion, and Dorian, his face sheet-white with shock and betrayal, finally understood what had really happened to his half-brother 8 years ago. "Lies!" Varian roared, jerking his hand from Isla's grip. But the damage was done. Every person present had felt his guilt, his premeditated murder of his own son. "Fratricide!" someone shouted from the crowd. "The king murdered his own heir. He's guilty. We all felt it." Lord Torben, standing among the assembled nobles, tried to slip toward the exit, but Rhiannon's warriors blocked his path. "The Truth-Seeker also revealed your conspiracy with the king," Rhiannon said coldly. "To murder an innocent Omega to protect his secrets. You're going nowhere, Torben." Varian stood, fury and desperation warring across his features. "This is a trick, some form of manipulation. The girl is my mate." Dorian's voice cut through the chaos, steady and clear. He'd broken free from his guards, was moving toward the dais. "And she's told nothing but truth. You murdered your own son because you couldn't stand that he was better than you. You tried to use me, planned to kill me the moment I'd served your purpose, and you threatened the woman who raised me to force my compliance." He stopped at the base of the dais, and when he looked up at his father, there was no love left in his expression, only cold determination. "By ancient law, I challenge you. As the only living heir of your blood, I claim right of succession through combat. The throne goes to whoever survives." The hall went utterly silent. This was the oldest law, older even than truth-seeking. The right of a son to challenge a father for leadership through combat to the death. Varian's smile was vicious. Finally, you show some spine. Very well, bastard. I accept your challenge. At least when I kill you, it will be honest rather than hidden. The crowd pulled back, creating a circle in the center of the hall. Dorian and Varian faced each other across 20 feet of polished stone. Neither wore armor. This would be fought in wolf form, the traditional way. Isla wanted to scream, to stop this, but Rhiannon's hand on her shoulder held her in place. This must happen, her grandmother whispered. It's the only way. Both men shifted, their bodies flowing from human to wolf with practiced ease. Varian's wolf was massive, golden-furred and heavily muscled, the wolf of a king in his prime, 48 years of life and countless battles making him formidable. But Dorian's wolf was larger, silver-white where his father was gold, younger and faster despite being smaller in bulk. The wolf of someone who'd spent 8 years surviving alone in the mountains, hunting and fighting for every meal. They circled each other, both looking for openings. Then Varian lunged. The fight was brutal. Varian fought with the experience of decades, using his weight and power to try to overwhelm his son. His jaws snapped for Dorian's throat. His claws raked for vulnerable spots. He fought dirty, going for eyes and tendons, seeking to cripple rather than kill cleanly. But Dorian was faster. He danced out of reach, using his agility to avoid the worst strikes. And when he counterattacked, it was with precision born of desperation. He fought for Isla, for Maren, for his murdered brother, for every year of isolation and pain. He fought with everything he had. Blood stained the white stone floor. Both wolves bore wounds, but Varian's were deeper. Age was catching up to him, his endurance failing against his son's relentless assault. Finally, Dorian saw his opening. Varian overextended, going for what he thought was a killing blow. Dorian rolled beneath the strike and came up inside his father's guard. His jaws closed around Varian's throat, not to crush, but to hold. Varian froze. One wrong move and Dorian's teeth would tear out his windpipe. The hall held its breath. Then Dorian bit down. It was quick, merciful, despite everything Varian had done. One moment the Alpha King lived, the next he was gone, his body shifting back to human form in death. Dorian released him and stepped back, his wolf form trembling with exhaustion. Blood matted his silver fur. But he was alive. The challenge is satisfied. One of the assembled alphas, a gray-haired man in the colors of the Eastern Territories, stepped forward. Varian is dead by his son's hand, as is his right. By ancient law and witness of this court, I acknowledge Dorian, son of Varian, as the rightful Alpha King. Other alphas joined in, their voices creating a chorus of acceptance. Hail King Dorian, long may he reign. Dorian shifted back to human form, accepting a cloak someone offered to cover his nakedness and his wounds. His eyes found Isla immediately, and the relief in them nearly broke her. She ran to him, and he caught her, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. You came, he whispered into her hair. You magnificent, terrifying woman. You came for me. Always, Isla promised. I'll always come for you. Around them, the court descended into organized chaos, as nobles rushed to declare loyalty to the new king, as Torben was dragged away in chains, as Maren was released from the dungeons and brought before her surviving child. But in that moment, Isla and Dorian existed in a bubble of their own. Mates reunited, truth triumphant, and a future, uncertain, but theirs to shape, stretching before them. Chapter 8. A Different Kind of Throne. The first weeks of Dorian's reign were turbulent. Alphas from across the territories descended on the capital, some to pledge loyalty, others to test the new king's resolve. Every morning brought petitions, disputes, and thinly veiled challenges to authority that had been violently won, but not yet firmly established. Dorian refused the heavy golden crown his father had favored, choosing instead a simpler circlet of silver etched with mountain peaks. He moved the throne from its elevated dais to floor level, declaring that any alpha who wished to speak with their king could do it standing eye to eye. Tradition demands respect for the throne, one of the older counselors protested. Respect is earned, not demanded by furniture placement, Dorian replied calmly. My father sat above everyone and looked down on his subjects. I prefer to face them directly. Isla watched him navigate these early conflicts with a mixture of pride and concern. He was learning to wear authority he'd never wanted, transforming from the exile who'd survived alone in the mountains to a king who had to consider an entire kingdom with every decision. Her own role took shape gradually. Dorian wanted her at his side as mate and equal, but Isla understood the old nobles would never accept a queen who'd arrived in a torn wedding gown, fleeing another alpha's ceremony. So she carved out a different position, one the ancient laws recognized even if modern courtiers had forgotten it existed, truth-seeker to the court. You will be the blade we draw when lies threaten the kingdom, Lady Rhiannon told her during one of their private strategy sessions. Not a weapon used carelessly, but one whose very presence reminds everyone that deception has consequences. The role proved necessary sooner than anyone expected. A delegation from the eastern borderlands arrived with elaborate gifts and flowery speeches about continued alliance. Their alpha, a man named Carver with 2 white teeth and calculating eyes, spoke of loyalty and mutual prosperity while presenting Dorian with a chest of gold coins. But Isla felt the lie the moment he extended his hand in formal greeting. Through her gift, she sensed his true intentions, probing for weakness, mapping vulnerabilities, planning to press for territorial concessions the moment Dorian showed uncertainty. After the formal audience, Dorian called his closest advisors to a private chamber. Rhiannon attended, along with Commander Oren and 3 of the Alphas who'd supported Dorian's challenge against Varian. Carver is testing you, Isla said without preamble. He doesn't believe you're strong enough to hold the throne. He plans to demand the fertile valleys along the southern border, land that rightfully belongs to the Redwater Pack. If you refuse, he'll call it weakness and spread that word to other Alphas. Can you prove this? Asked one of the older Alphas, a grizzled warrior named Fenwick. I can make the court feel his intentions as clearly as I felt them, Isla replied. Truth-seekers don't just sense deception. We can reveal it to witnesses. 2 days later, when Carver formally requested the contested borderlands during open court, Isla stepped forward. Alpha Carver, will you submit to truth-seeking on this matter? She asked, her voice carrying through the packed hall. To prove your claim is made in good faith? Carver's smile faltered. Is this necessary, Your Majesty? When I'm uncertain if I'm hearing honest counsel or manipulation, yes, Dorian said from his throne. My truth-seeker mate offers you the chance to prove your sincerity. Unless you have reason to refuse. Trapped by pride and witnesses, Carver extended his hand. The moment Isla touched him, she pulled forward the clearest thread of his deception, his contempt for young kings, his calculated plan to seize land from weaker packs, his smug certainty that Dorian was too inexperienced to recognize the theft. The court gasped as Carver's emotions flooded through them, as undeniable as if he'd shouted his schemes aloud. You came here planning to steal from the Redwater Pack, Dorian said quietly, standing. You assumed I wouldn't notice or wouldn't care. You were wrong on both counts. Carver dropped to his knees, stammering excuses. Dorian let him grovel just long enough for every watching Alpha to understand the price of attempted deception. You will make restitution to Redwater, Dorian declared. Triple the value of the land you sought, paid in goods and warriors for 5 years. Refuse, and we discuss whether you're fit to lead at all. Word of the judgment spread faster than any royal decree. Within days, visiting nobles stopped treating the new king as an untested boy. The resolution of Isla's uncle Garrick came swiftly and without ceremony. Lady Rhiannon had moved decisively once evidence of his falsified records and debt manipulation became public. She absorbed his failing pack into Silverpine's territory, installing new leadership chosen by consensus from both groups. Saris stood near the back of the hall, stripped of her fine silks, eyes fixed on the floor, a minor clerk in the new order. Isla felt no triumph at the sight, only a distant, quiet relief that the girl who'd once slapped her for speaking truth would never again hold power over anyone's future. When Garrick was brought before the throne, stripped of his title and authority, Isla felt nothing. No satisfaction, no anger. Just empty acknowledgement of justice finally served. You offered your niece to a murderer to buy yourself time, Dorian said, his voice carrying the weight of formal judgment. Not to save your pack from starvation, but to avoid admitting your own failures as a leader. I did what I had to, Garrick protested weakly. No, Isla said, stepping forward. You did what was easiest for you. You had other options. You chose the one that cost you nothing and me everything. Dorian didn't order execution or exile. Instead, Garrick was assigned to work under Rhiannon's stewards, rebuilding what his incompetence had nearly destroyed. Sometimes living with your mistakes is harsher than death, Dorian told Isla that night. He'll spend the rest of his life surrounded by people who know exactly what he did. Torben fared worse. His conspiracy with Varian, combined with the revelation through Isla's gift of his 3 murdered wives, left him with no allies and no defense. Offered a choice between permanent exile beyond the northern borders or confinement in a coastal fortress, he chose exile. If you ever return to these territories, Dorian told him during the final judgment, there will be no trial, no ceremony, only execution. Maren, rescued from the dungeons and nursed back to health, refused the grand quarters Dorian tried to give her. I'm too old for fancy rooms, she said, swatting his arm affectionately. Give me something small near the kitchens where I can hear honest talk and smell good cooking. She settled into modest chambers near the servants' quarters and proceeded to become one of the palace's most beloved residents, telling anyone who would listen about Dorian's childhood and his stubborn determination to fix everything. He gets that serious look still, she told Isla one afternoon as they walked through the palace gardens. Like the whole world is his problem to solve. You're good for him. You make him remember he's allowed to be happy. Weeks after Varian's death, Isla realized she'd missed her cycle twice. She waited another week to be certain, paying attention to the subtle changes in her body that her gift made impossible to ignore. The life growing inside her was small yet, barely a whisper, but undeniably present. She told Dorian in their private chambers after a long day of council meetings. He was removing his boots when she said simply, I'm pregnant. His hands stilled. Then he looked up at her, searching her face for confirmation of what he'd heard. How certain? He asked, voice rough. Certain. He stood slowly, crossing to where she sat. His hands came up to frame her face, thumbs brushing her cheekbones with aching gentleness. I'm terrified, he admitted. So am I, Isla replied. But I think that means we'll pay attention. We'll try to do it right. Through their bond, she felt his emotions crash through him. Joy so fierce it burned, fear sharp as winter ice. And beneath both, a determination that made her chest tighten. My father was a monster, Dorian said quietly. I won't become him. You're already not him, Isla assured him. You question yourself. You listen. You care about people beyond what they can do for you. That's where being a good father starts. When they told Rhiannon and Maren, both women reacted with unrestrained delight. No grand announcements, Rhiannon declared immediately. No treating Isla like political spectacle. This is family first, kingdom concerns second. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Isla continued her truth-seeker duties through the early months, though Dorian grew increasingly protective when she showed signs of exhaustion. You nearly collapsed after that river rights dispute, he said one afternoon when she'd planned to attend a particularly contentious border negotiation. That alpha was lying so badly it gave me a headache, Isla countered. I didn't collapse from pregnancy. They compromised. Isla attended every other session, sending detailed recommendations through Rhiannon when she rested. It was strange learning to balance duty with the growing awareness of the child she carried, but the rhythm felt right. As spring turned to summer, they made a pilgrimage to the mountain cabin. The journey took longer with Isla's condition, but Dorian insisted. This is where it started, he said, as they rode through thinning trees toward higher elevation. Where you found me, and I found reasons to stop just existing. The cabin looked smaller than Isla remembered, but stepping inside brought a flood of memories. The bed where she'd woken wearing his clothes. The hearth where her wedding dress had burned. The wooden stool where he'd first said, I know who you are. They spent one night there alone, away from court politics and royal responsibilities. Just the two of them and the growing life between them. This is where everything changed, Dorian said, as they lay together in the narrow bed, his hand resting over her stomach. You walked through that door half frozen and entirely desperate. And somehow you made me remember what it felt like to want something beyond survival. You were infuriating, Isla replied. Mysterious and brooding. You were stubborn and reckless. We still are, she pointed out. Yes, he agreed. But now we're stubborn and reckless together. 3 months later, in the early autumn when leaves turned gold and the air carried the first hint of coming winter, Isla gave birth to a daughter. By then, the healers called the pregnancy full term. No more waiting, no more counting the weeks since that first missed bleeding. The labor was long but uncomplicated. Mirren attended, along with the palace's most skilled midwife and Lady Rhiannon, who held Isla's hand through the worst contractions and whispered encouragement when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm. When the baby finally arrived, screaming her fury at the world with healthy lungs, Dorian wept openly. He held his daughter with trembling hands, this tiny life that was his responsibility to protect and guide. She has your eyes, he said, studying the infant's face, and my stubborn expression already. Moon help us all. Mirren muttered fondly from where she tidied the room. They named her Brenna, after Dorian's mother. The woman who'd loved a son the world tried to make invisible, and died never seeing him valued as he deserved. The kingdom celebrated, but quietly, as Rhiannon had insisted. No grand spectacles, no political maneuvering around a newborn. Just genuine joy from people who'd watched their new king transform from exile to leader, from broken to whole. As the months passed and Brenna grew from helpless infant to curious child, Isla and Dorian settled into the strange duality of their lives. They were king and truth-seeker, responsible for a kingdom's welfare, but they were also simply parents, learning to navigate sleepless nights and first smiles. Years later, when Brenna was old enough to ask questions, she would climb into her mother's lap and demand, "Tell me how you and Papa met." Isla would tell the truth. Not a sanitized legend, but the real story of fear and desperation, of a cabin in a snowstorm, and a man who'd chosen kindness when cruelty would have been easier. "Your father saved my life," Isla would say. "But more than that, he saw me when everyone else had decided I didn't matter. And I saw him when he'd convinced himself he deserved to be invisible." "And then you lived happily ever after?" Brenna would ask. "No," Isla would reply honestly. "Then we worked very hard to build something good. Happiness isn't a destination you arrive at and stay forever. It's something you choose to create, day after day, even when it's difficult." Dorian, listening from the doorway, would add, "Your mother is wise. Listen to her more than me." And Brenna, already showing signs of her parents' combined stubbornness, would declare, "I'll listen to both of you, and then decide for myself." In those moments, watching their daughter grow into her own person, Isla understood that this was what they'd truly built. Not a perfect kingdom, because no such thing existed, but a place where truth mattered, where justice could be more than a word, where an exile and a runaway bride could become something neither had dreamed possible. The throne Dorian sat wasn't the same one his father had wielded like a weapon. It had been transformed, like everything else, into something different, something worth protecting. The end.